Hi, this is Paul. Today we're going to play with politics and mysticism and Russia and Ukraine and Alexandr Dugin and broad civilizations rising and fallings. Yeah, we're going to really cover some stuff today. Nate Heil sent me this video, the Unregistered Podcast with Thaddeus Russell. I've watched a few of these over the time. He tends to have some very interesting guests on, and in this case, he had Michael Millerman. I'd seen little bits of Michael Millerman here or there. Sherry was interested in this, sent it to Nate. Nate sent it to me. I'm getting my exercise routines back in going now, which means get some time to listen to some stuff. Don't get any ideas there, Mark and Andrea. And so I listened to this, and this was interesting. Let's start where even Thaddeus Russell doesn't quite know where he wants to begin.
Wait, whole mysticism, your first intellectual interest, I take it, right? Was mysticism?
Yeah, intellectual and existential.
Okay.
In other words, it's not just the conceptual exercise, because when you read the account that the mystics give of the experience they regard as the culmination of their life of questing for truth, beauty, and goodness and divinity, holiness and all of that, it's not just a conceptual act or operation, although the intellect is involved. It's an all-consuming fire. And that's true, I think, for all of the mystics who write about it. And that was something that was extremely appealing to me, not just as an idea, but as something that you would want to put yourself through. You know what I mean?
Oh, I know nothing about this, my friend. We haven't even talked about this. I know that your work, and we'll get into this, it deals with mysticism. But I didn't know it was this central in your life, and especially in your intellectual life. So first of all, I know nothing about mysticism, the history of it, and nothing. So teach me. First of all, how do you define it? What makes someone a mystic?
Okay, here's the simplest first approximation, I think. You read accounts of people who are called mystics, and for the most part, the centerpiece of what they have to say is a direct encounter with God that's not mediated by the natural world. So there is a kind of nature mysticism where you're walking through the woods, or you see the snow blowing through the sky and the light glistening on it, and you have some sort of feeling of profound serenity or sublimity. So there's that kind of thing. But and that's legitimate, that's valid, and you could call that a form of mysticism as well, where you've had some breakthrough to a deeper dimension of existence, either in this unmediated way that you just have like lightning strike inside your soul, and you're trying to understand what just happened, what was that lightning, or you heard, or you have like Plotinus, the Neoplatonic mystic, says it's difficult to describe the mystic vision because what you see and your active seeing, it's all one. So it's this sense of a transcendental oneness where you've overcome your subjectivity, your difference, your alterity, yourself, your ego self, and you haven't dissolved it into some sort of nothingness. You have brought it to some sort of beatific vision or some sort of intimate union or encounter with the Almighty. That's roughly the way that it's described and expressed. And something that was incredible to me as I read, for example, Christian mystics, Jewish mystics, Kabbalists, Islamic mystics, and things like that, is this was a key insight actually for me at the time that later mapped over into my academic work. It seemed that everybody was having some kind of fundamental existential experience that they were then turning around and interpreting in terms of the language that was available to them and best known to them from their tradition. So for example, a Christian might come out of the religious experience and say, I'm crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. Or they might say that they had, like the Orthodox mystics do, the mysterious light of Tabor. They experienced it in their souls. Or some other formulation drawn from the language available to them from their Christian readings and doctrines and texts. And likewise, an Islamic mystic would have recourse to figures from Islamic thought. Jewish tradition would have recourse to figures from Jewish thought. So that observation gave me the complex interplay between interpretation, the interpretation of the experience in the language that's available to the person who had it, and some encounter that seems to break through to a more fundamental level. So that sort of back and forth, like going to the foundations and coming back out and trying to talk about it. Now, the reason I say that's relevant to my later academic work is because, in part, I did something like that in my dissertation study, where I did a comparative study of receptions of Heidegger by political philosophers. That's like structurally analogous, roughly, to a comparative study of various mystical traditions on the basis of their encounter with God. Here, it's the comparative study of various political theory traditions on the basis of their encounter with Heidegger. How do they get that encounter, come out of it, and put it in terms that are available to them, that are familiar to them, and make sense of it? And another one is like the extent. So imagine that you could go to the Holy of Holies, so to speak, to the inner citadel. Okay, you have the key that unlocks the last door in a sequence of doors. So in other words, there's like a scale of intensity of the proximity to the absolute or whatever, okay? Like a degree of mystical illumination. Mm-hmm. So somebody, for example, made it into the inner courtyard and didn't make it further. And then they say, you know what? There is nothing further. Okay, that's like, you can understand the logic, the psychological logic and the spiritual logic of that. They made it one step. They didn't make it the next step. So they spurn or spite the idea that there could be anything further. And then they just treat the outer courtyard or the inner courtyard as the end of the story. It's kind of similar, in my view, with Heidegger, for example. So some people look at it, they try to get through to the meaning of Heidegger's teaching. They get blocked or stuck in the outer courtyard or in the inner courtyard or somewhere. And then they say, there must not be anything else going on there. They turn around and they establish some other teaching or doctrine. So it's sort of like that whole complicated interplay between teaching, interpretation, and our ability to get into the heart of things, the intensity of our access to the teaching. That's like a key theme before and after academia, with and without Heidegger. But it started with those mystical authors.
Okay. You are presuming that there is a heart of the matter, right? You're presuming, I take it, that there is something deeper. You're presuming, it sounds like, that when they say they had an encounter with God, you believe that.
So my view is that we don't need to presume that they did or that they didn't. You could try to explain away the accounts in some other light, some other perspective. So you could say, this is just a return to the experience of being in the womb, where everything is an undifferentiated oneness, and so on. But the way of reading that I think offers the most is, number one, kind of like a phenomenology of the mystical experience, which means actually trying to understand as much as possible what they're claiming and the basis on which they're claiming it. Is there any legitimacy to those kinds of linguistic, hermeneutic, conceptual operations that would force us at the outset to interpret them psychologically or in terms of evolutionary biology or whatever the case is? So number one is like the intention of reading them as though they could be true. Are they consistent? Do they make sense? What concepts are we bringing to the text? So the whole problem now, not just of their interpretation of the experience they had, but of our task as readers of their interpretation. So the whole problem of how do you read carefully in a meaningful way without distorting it, somebody's account of their own encounter with what they call the truth or the source of their insights. And that's another big piece of the puzzle. So my approach to the text is, we don't want to dogmatically consider them true at the outset, and we don't want to dogmatically consider them untrue at the outset, meaning we have to have an approach to the texts that is open to the possibility that they did have that, we can learn from it, and it's feasible. Which is why I say that my original interest in mysticism was more than just intellectual. It would have to include an existential dimension, because so many of the authors say, for example, they say, I'll just give you an example, okay? We meditated and fasted for 20 days, and then we repeated this prayer for 20 hours, right? And then we felt the warm glow in our heart, for example. So now imagine you read something like that and you say, okay, what might I have to do to be a competent judge of that claim? Am I actually a competent judge if I haven't done those things? Well, maybe. Now, it doesn't mean everybody has to do it, but what now if I find 10 other mystics who also claimed that as a result of having done that, as a result of having done X, they experienced Y. So I thought, like, okay, you have to throw yourself into it. If you really want to grasp it, at least you have to throw yourself into other people's account of it as you try to make sense of it. You see?
Okay.
So
So
I just want to add this idea of throwing ourselves into something we don't understand to try to make sense of it. That basic principle, not discounting it at the outset, you see it plays out in my later interests in some thinkers who are not considered mainstream.
Indeed, and this is why we know each other, by the way.
Okay, that's a good start on the mysticism end of this. Okay, that little piece about mysticism. Where on earth does that fit in with everything that I do here? As if we can sort of run it all down and figure it out. Oh, I got to check my sound level. So a while back, Jordan Peterson asking the academics from Word on Fire basically about, maybe it wasn't them, but basically, why doesn't the Roman Catholic Church step up and be the religion at the center of Western civilization? You want to go back to that fight? I was just reading last night the book by Andrew Preston, he was a guest on the Rest is History podcast, talking about American Crusades. That gets into the establishment Protestantism theme that I was pursuing in a lot of my videos. Western liberal culture is an experiment in an attempt to ground a civilization in something other than the overtly religiously sacred and divine. I'll say it that way. Obviously, Roman Catholic medieval civilization had its grounding in the Roman Catholic Church. Orthodox civilizations have had their grounding in their religion. Islamic civilization, Jewish civilization, Brahminist civilization, and before that, of course, there are animisms and shamanisms, etc., etc., etc. But the attempt of the West is to have a society without a specific, as viewed from a secular perspective, religious foundation. And it's an open question how long such a thing can last. Now, this is in the midst of, over the 20th century and into the 21st century, huge geopolitical, religious culture wars, not only within civilizations, but between them. And so when Jordan Peterson talks about, the Roman Catholics should just step in, it's like, whoa, you just sort of triggered a fight that has been raging for the last 500 years in the West. Sometimes it breaks out in hot wars. That's what happened after the Protestant Reformation. Often it's sort of a much quieter war, and in many ways, the United States is sort of a battleground in that. In refusing to establish a state church, it afforded the attempted flourishing of many different religious traditions, and this has obviously changed Catholicism. In a sense, Catholicism had to learn how to live in the house of establishment Protestantism, and the ways that has changed Catholicism has been quite interesting. Now, at the same time, we have the recession of modernity. Modernity is going away, but it's not going away completely because we don't want to lose many of the things that modernity and the Enlightenment and liberalism have brought us, but this is one of the issues. Another thing that we tend to bump into often in this channel are psychedelics. Well, what's that about? Well, think about psychedelics as mysticism in a pill. Let's talk about it that way. Mysticism in a pill. Instead of having to go through the initiation, this is, of course, one of the pieces that Jonathan Peugeot keeps pointing to, and instead of having to go through initiation into a tradition, instead of having to master the body and master the self and all of these things that monastic orders have been majoring in for centuries, you can take a substance and you can have an experience that will in some ways replace or approximate or at least pass for, within some circles, what the mystics were attempting to achieve. And for that reason, well, maybe instead of, because we can't get everybody into the monastery, this gets into the 1-speed, 2-speed thing that I've talked about with respect to Charles Taylor, maybe we can just have everybody trip out of LSD, and then suddenly everyone will be mystics on command, and then the question is always, and then what? What will they build? Or will they just keep tripping? So we've got that piece. Historically, again, we have the turn from texts. That happens in the Renaissance. All these Europeans start taking Latin names. Everyone starts polishing their Latin to make it as Romanish as possible. And of course, Erasmus starts comparing the Vulgate with the Hebrew and Greek texts that he can find, and issues arise. Martin Luther starts playing with this, and of course we have the Protestant Reformation, which is a turn to the text. At that point, again, if you wanted to study physics, you would open a text and study Aristotle. Then we have the turn away from the texts, much more to the observations of what we call the natural world. So you have Galileo going up onto a tower and dropping spheres and timing them to see whether they land at the same time, and you have Newton, etc., etc., etc. Why that turn from the text to regular, viewable, consistent patterns in the empirical world? Why do we do that? Because we somehow have to span the Protestant Catholic and eventually the Jewish divide and the Muslim divide. And as colonialism takes off and gets larger and larger, the entire world. Well, we may not be able to agree on what we mean by God, on how to be one with God, on what goodness means, on what a good life means. We might dead reckon, approximate proximal betterment, some of these kinds of things. But what we can agree is that if you drop these two spheres, this is what will happen. Maybe on the basis of that, we can create a civilization that manages to account for and facilitate and manage the pluralism that all of the diverse traditions and histories and ethnicities of the world have been trying to bridge. Now, one might look and say, well, if men and women can't really agree on just about on many different things, how on earth are we supposed to we can't bridge the gap between men and women with any of these things. So why this? Okay. One way to think about the world since, as Charles Mann calls it, the Columbian Exchange, although the issues were there before then, obviously, because Eurasia and Africa were connected, and people continued to encounter strange people, barbarians, people who are not like us. The struggle with pluralism. How on earth do we deal with all of these differences? And these differences arise through history. They arise through geography. They arise through struggles. They arise through conflicts. They arise through religions. They arise through all these things. How do we deal with pluralism, and how do we get on with the matter? In many respects, it's just an expression of the battle of the one and the many. And what's interesting about this video with Michael Millerman is that he'll go on to talk about Leo Strauss, who I know very little about, but that was very interesting. And basically sort of use mysticism as, and I think this is actually what's behind, let's say, even the interest in psychedelics, a way to have one thing by which the many can be transcended. The one thing through which pluralism can be accommodated. Now, this attempt to deal with pluralism is a desire that is all over the place. Some people like to fight. Other people don't. we are troubled by claims of exclusivism that are contradicting others. Maybe you believe that your Christian faith is true and that Jesus is the only way, but your Jewish neighbor says Jesus can't be God. That's ridiculous. And his Muslim neighbor agrees with him. And the New Age neighbor says, well, Jesus is just one light of many. And you follow Jesus and I follow these other lights. And by this way, we all climb up to God. And then your materialist neighbor down the road says, well, but all of these religions basically are a way for us to have a little bit higher thought. They have their purpose, but none of them is ultimate. And they all have their contribution to our moral and cultural life. But in the end, the real thing is that we should pass our days from 0 to 100 in as much happiness and peace as possible. And we should get along with everyone. And we should work together using reason and science to build as good a world as possible. And then the other person down the street says, well, I agree that we should all work together to build as lovely and as peaceful and as suffering-free world as possible, but your religions are getting in the way, and so off we go. And so we have all of these attempts to sort of bridge these divides and get rid of them. And so all of these proposals at one thing or another that will sort of sort out the pluralism and bring it all together. Well, if everyone would just take psychedelics, and then we would all see that everything is one, and then we would stop then harping on the particulars and live that way. Well, that's a nice thing to do. I'm a little skeptical as to whether or not the oneness that you perceive includes giving me your car and turning over your house and letting me, have my way with whatever it is that you hold sacred. No, that would be you letting down the demand of oneness on you. Oh, well, I don't frankly see that this is going to be much of an improvement. And so I found this treatment of mysticism quite clear. And again, in some ways, as he presents it, well, this basically all of these mystics from various traditions are all having direct communion with God without going through nature. And that's not a small piece to this, because it's, of course, through our contextual multiple engagements with the natural order that things will arise. Well, I think God should be worshipped on the mountaintops. I think we should have altars on all of the high places. Oh, no, it's only in Jerusalem that you should have your altar. Jerusalem, no, it's Mount Gerizim. Oh, no, it's not Mount Gerizim. Mount Olympus is where the gods live. Oh, it's Kilimanjaro. Don't you know anything? Oh, it's the god of the plains and Tatanka and the buffalo and. So, in other words, with an immediate experience of, and then you can put all sorts of words in, but as long as you believe that all of these words are talking about the same thing, then it doesn't really matter, or at least as long as you assert that everyone is using all of these same words for the same things, then it doesn't matter. Then maybe mysticism itself will be the key to address pluralism. Now, a few weeks ago, one of the channels that I was delighted to find was this very interesting one. And Yosef from the Discord server sent me this video, and I played a little bit of it then, and I'll play a little bit of it now, because it's interesting to me how it is in the modern period that you have the nouning of mysticism.
Mysticism transforms from an adjective, mystical theology or mystical interpretation, to a noun, la mystique. According to the groundbreaking and frankly near impossible to read scholarship of Michel de Certeau, this change is hardly a mere semantic or grammatical quirk, but a serious matter with serious implications. De Certeau believes that as science and religion in the 17th century became further split from one another, the category of literature emerges, particularly that of poetry.
Now, okay, science and religion begin to divide. Well, in many ways, the pursuit of science is an attempt to deal with the pluralism of religion, because there's one science. And so, for example, during the COVID pandemic, well, we're going to let science decide. And Peugeot quite rightly said, science decides nothing. And Vervaeke quite rightly says, well, should we apply science to the assumptions beneath science? Because you can't really do that. And in some ways, literature itself as a classification is in some ways the same thing. I mean, all of these are ways at trying to get around the pervasive interpretive pluralism that has plagued how many different traditions.
Precisely that which does not attempt to convey information in a clear and transparent fashion as scientific prose does, but which aims rather to obscure and contain multiple simultaneous layers, connotations, and implications hidden within. And
now, you could also use Jordan Peterson's observation about literature, that in what ways is literature more true than, let's say, an attempt to retell the physical layer of history? Well, it's an abstraction, and so it gets at truths that are in history, but says it in a way that sort of transcends history. Now he's going below, and Peterson goes above, but, same attempt.
And just as mystical in the past had meant the exploration and discovery of the hidden meaning, mysticism as a noun, la mystique, now according to Dessertu, emerged and came to be aligned with the non-scientific, i.e. the religious world of literature, the realm of poetry, metaphor, and mystery. The effect of this, in Dessertu's opinion, ironically, was actually the emancipation of mysticism from religion. Whereas before the word mystical only had meaning insofar as it was attached merely as a grammatical modifier to a religious noun, mystical theology, for example, now, for the first time in history, mysticism could be linguistically and conceptually stood on its own two grammatical feet.
Now, there's absolutely no coincidence that this is happening at the same time as you have the rise of the secular, which is in some ways the secret sister of the church. But now you don't need to go to church. You just can sort of be religious without Jesus and the supernatural and all of those claims and all of that stuff. Because once you have claims of the miraculous, things which break the kind of repetitive, observable things in nature, well, then, who's to say Jesus miracles or the Buddha's miracles or Islamic miracles or Jewish miracles or Hindu miracles, on and on and on and on.
The transformation of mysticism into a noun, then, the nounification of mysticism, according to Dessertu, signifies and catalyzes the autonomy of the category of mysticism from its native religious Christian habitat. A fierce grammatical appendance that would be a sign and pave the way for things more radical yet to come. This new word, writes Dessertu, shows the distressed fault line between the clergy holding onto their authority to interpret the true deeper meaning of the sacred texts and the power that came along with that, versus the lay people for whom these texts, upon which the mystical had been laid in the Middle Ages, were no longer all that compelling and convincing. This emergence of the independent category of mysticism began a gradual process of the secularization of mysticism, and, as a result, mysticism quickly became a term of derision and upset among Christian clergy.
Now, one might say, well, what do you mean this all comes from Christianity, this mysticism? Can't we find it in Jewish mystics and Muslim mystics, et cetera, et cetera? And, quite rightly, well, what we're sort of doing is we're taking this word that we have in the Christian world and looking around at what other people are doing and the experiences that they're having. Gets back into Michael Millerman when he's talking about, well, we're looking at their interpretive experiences, and, well, that's this. And what you're having an experience with is God. And as Millerman said, well, people are going to say, well, this is what happens when you do these kinds of practices, and it's impacting the amount of oxygen that you have to the brain, and it's programming the brain through your physical sensations and yada, yada, yada. And so maybe we can just shortchange all that and save a bunch of time and blunt force it with a pill. But it's all looking at the same thing. So finally, we have sort of a philosopher's stone to address pluralism, to turn all of the lead of the world into the gold of unity. That would be a powerful thing. Instead of the natural world where we can measure gravity and where we can measure time and where we can we can do chemistry and biology and physics and we can do all that, that hasn't brought the kind of unity with respect to all of the upper register things that we human beings are so good at and what really gives us a tremendous amount of uniqueness. Well, now we can have one system, perhaps on top, so we've got some idealism going on here, perhaps on top that can, in fact, change the whole world because, of course, we see the world through the upper register. We see the world through the first personal. Now, part of the weakness of this is, of course, that the mysticism is an individual thing in many respects, that whether you're getting at it, you're blunt forcing it through a psychedelic, or you're getting at it through a religious tradition. Well, what did you see? Well, this is what I saw. And what did you see? Well, this is what I saw. And we're seeing the same thing. Are you really going to get around the pluralism this way? Is because, as Michael Milner said, well, you have to interpret it through the language that you've been given. Well, what secularity offers, of course, is, well, here's a non-sectarian language that can transcend all of the pluralism.
Besides for the rejection of the mystical, while still an adjective by earlier Protestants such as Martin Luther, mysticism during the 17th century became an object of severe ridicule and pejorative even to Catholics, often ridiculed for lacking religious authenticity, genealogy, and history, accused of having been around for no longer than 3 or 4 centuries, starting only with figures like Meister Eckhart and John of the Cross, but having no further authentic genealogy within the church. The fans of mysticism, however, did not sit around idly while their category took a beating. What they did, according to Dessertu, was to boldly retroactively fabricate a mystical tradition, taking pre-existing Christian saints and texts, christening them as part of this new canon of mystics and mystical literature through the publishing of hagiographies, literally sacred biographies, anthologies, and long lists of canonical Christian mystics of the past, cementing the memory of this illustrious tradition of Christian mysticism post facto, stretching all the way back to the early church fathers, far before John of the Cross and Eckhart in the 12th and 13th centuries. This new old tradition of mysticism was created, according to Dessertu, primarily through these hagiographic texts, through these sacred biographies, which shifted the focus of the biography from the virtuosity and miracles of the saints of the past, is the way that they were traditionally written, towards their unique experiences and their extraordinary states of mind.
Notice the shift from the miracles. Well, we're not going to be able to agree with the miracles. Let's go to their experiences. And, well, because here's the fun thing, and this is what we've discovered, obviously, in the fights over pluralism in the modern period. If you go to a marriage counselor, well, we're not going to talk about your interpretation of that fight that you two had. Let's just talk about your feelings. Let's talk about your experience. Let's not interpret it, because once we have the interpretation, we're going to have conflict. But let's just talk about, this is what I felt. Feelings are neither right or wrong. They just are. Experiences are neither right or wrong. They just are. So the focus away from what it had been, and now maybe through this way we can get beyond the pervasive interpretive pluralism,
opening the way for the perception of mysticism as a psychological category primarily, an obscure universal dimension of man perceived or experienced as a reality hidden between a diversity of institutions, religions, and doctrines, to quote.
Notice that. An obscure universal dimension of man, human, let's say. This must have been written in 1992. How dare he? A universal dimension of humanhood, perceived or experienced as a reality hidden beneath the diversity of institutions, religions, and doctrines.
Two, a subjective experience potentially available to all and amenable.
A subjective experience, so it's neither right nor wrong, it's just what I experienced, now available to all, hence universal. Oh, you had the same experience too? well, do you really know it was the same? Are you really going to be able to hold back on interpreting it? Because once you interpret it into action in the world, my guess is there's going to be a diversity of interpretations that are going to come.
To open study by modern scholars, away both in experience and theory from the prior monopoly of Christianity. But all we have at this point in the history is the mere seeds of what we now know to have followed, and let us do the slow and careful work of following those seeds as they become saplings and sprouts, because the history of mysticism is far from a simple straight line of development. There's going to be a lot of interesting twists and turns until we get to where we stand today. It's only in 1736, during the
Now, and he runs through this, and it's a great summary. You're going to go through the New England Transcendentalists, and if you go to Michael Milner's story, it's very interesting. So he's in high school and has to write a paper on the Transcendentalists, and he's not a very good student. And before the teacher hands back the papers, the teacher basically says, "There's one paper that, this is the kind of thing that every student would love to hear their teacher say about them." He, of course, doesn't believe it's about him because he's not a great student. There was one amazing student in there, and it was his paper. And he's like, he's a natural mystic in some way. This stuff comes together for him. Now, remember, and we didn't get into this part of the story with establishment Protestantism, but I know that Sam was sort of chafing at the bit on this. Establishment Protestantism really does go through the New England Transcendentalist in a significant way. Because you in many ways get around the naughty business of the Trinity into just the experience of oneness that you have in the mystics. Now, Thoreau might be a nature mystic, and he might be meditating on Golden Pond and considering the ant, etc., but of course, others will bypass nature and attempt to arrive at a vision of unity that is not mediated by the natural world.
Okay, so what you found, is this correct? You found mystics across regions, across cultures, across the world, right? That you're saying...
And across time.
And across time. And you're saying that you found commonality among them. You found some common threads. They said similar things about their experience with God?
Yes.
Holy shit, man.
Yeah. And that was...
Okay.
There's
now why would one be surprised by this? Well, because again, in the modernist frame, or in the materialist frame, one's experience of God arises out of a psychological experience with the natural of order, with all the contextualities of an individual culture or the experience of the people. And so we would expect to find religious diversity because we have all of the diversity that goes on in human culture and human history and human geography, etc. For the Norsemen, hell would be a cold place, and for the people of the dry, hot Middle East, hell would be a hot place, etc. So we're finding one thing across mysticism. Maybe mysticism is the thing that's going to transcend all of the pluralism.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's amazing because it suggests the possibility of a trans-historical fundamental experience of human encounter with something greater than ourselves. Right?
Yikes. Say that again.
Which is pretty...
Say that again. Say it again.
So it suggests the possibility of a trans-historical, meaning it's not just a matter of 21st century late capitalism or something like that, right? It's in principle accessible to man as man at any given time, given the kind of being that we are.
And you can very much see the appeal of this. It's now we don't have to sit down and look at Christianity and look at Islam and look at Judaism and look at Hindu religion and look at Buddhism and look at shamanisms and look at all of these and to try to decide which one is right. Well, you can just go directly there. And in fact, if you take the psychedelic path, you don't even need to spend years initiated into a particular practice to achieve this vision. You just get it by dropping a little acid.
to transcend some limitation or horizon or cross some threshold and encounter or meet. I mean, how you say it becomes possibly here either inviting or disinviting, depending on who hears it. But right, some fundamental experience of transcending ourselves in the direction of something greater, and not just greater. Like if I transcend myself in the direction of the nation, or I transcend myself in the direction of the international working class,
right,
that's a kind of horizontal self-transcendence. I'm getting beyond myself to some other social category, big or small. But we're talking about a vertical self-transcendence. We're talking about a transcendence in the direction of either downward in Heideggerian language to the ground of our existence, or upward in another type of topography to the source, to the to the beginning of, so that kind of thing. And it was
and of course this would be tremendously attractive to people who say, well, I can't believe in Christianity because you have all these different churches competing for things. Well, at least in theory now, there's no church that you have to be mediated by. You can have this direct experience, okay? And I find this hope to be at the bottom of a whole bunch of, really a whole variety of religious vendors in the spiritual marketplace among us.
Amazing. It did not seem like the kind of experience you would just want to discount too quickly, given its importance and given the attestation.
My friend, I mean, you might have found evidence of the existence of God.
Well, the way he said that, whoosh, back into our normal fights about religion.
Well, look.
Yes, that's what's happening here.
It's more, it seems blasphemous to say it's more than that, but yeah, different people could derive different insights, cynical or genuine, on the basis of, what I've just described. Because even if you say, no, none of that tells you anything about the existence or lack of existence of God. Let's suppose that, okay? No, mystical experience tells us nothing about the existence or non-existence.
Millerman has been around a little bit. He knows what the detractors are going to say. Well, you can write this off as psychological states. You can write this off as biochemical. You can write this off as how many different ways, but
of God. Okay. It tells us something about the possibilities of human existence, that we could have an experience that we interpret in those terms. So at the very least, we want to try to understand, in my view, what does that tell us about the possibilities of human existence? Maybe the interpretation is wrong.
So he dials it back, which is very wise in a context like this.
That's an encounter with God, in the radical rejection of that.
Yeah.
But what does it mean that we're the kind of being that can have such a existential break with the world as we know it, that people interpret that like an encounter with God?
And that is a very good question.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
So all of that suddenly becomes like, wow, well, I mean, if you're not interested in going there, fine, don't go there. But if you are, then how deep can we go, right?
That's just brilliant and amazing. I didn't even know this about your work or about your history. Yeah. Or about mystics. That's phenomenal. Yeah. Across time, across space, they're saying similar things about their encounter with God.
Now it's interesting how this is Thaddeus Russell's. This is the value. Remember, we see opportunities and obstacles. This is the opportunity he sees. And I think this response is going to be very typical of many who look around at all of the different spiritual and religious options on the menu in the West and say, oh, maybe this is one that can incorporate them all and finally do an end to pluralism.
Different languages, so they couldn't have read each other.
Yeah, the thing is, and I want to draw another connection here, because there is one, as weird as it may seem, to Leo Strauss, the scholar of the history of political philosophy.
Yeah, right.
But let me just set out the first thing here.
For people who don't know, the godfather of neoconservatism. For people who don't know, this is a very important guy, Leo Strauss. Yes.
Yeah, like back in the day at the time of the Iraq War, if you Google Leo Strauss, it would be like Leo Strauss told neoconservatives to lie to the unwashed masses so that we, the elites, can go get blood for oil, etc. You know, it was like noble lies because Strauss was a reader of Plato and Plato talked about noble lying. But the fact is that Strauss was the most eminent scholar of the history of political philosophy in the 20th century, if not of all time.
Yes.
A great man, a great teacher, and an inspiration for me in a big, big way. But the mystic thing. So imagine you have here a text all about being crucified with Christ, and here a text all about something else. Okay, a different language. It required one step further to see that there's to entertain the hypothesis that they're saying the same thing in terms of the language that's available to them. So in other words, it was like you had to go slightly beneath the surface of just what's being said to the experience that's being spoken about.
Now that was a very interesting move, because here you have the language, and what language does is language communicates experience. And in some ways, the symbolism track is similar to this, because there's something underneath that the particular instantiated contextual cultural expression is given. And you can see that when we go back to this tradition of mystical readings of the text. And this is, this is even a struggle that we're dealing with. You go to C.S. Lewis's Miracles, and well, how do you interpret all of these particular assertions that are even historical? And Lewis will sort of back off a little bit and say, well, you have to understand what these historical assertions and events are pointing to. And so again, you almost have sort of a two-tier system. And well, if there's a two-tier system, and if the top tier is obvious and plain, well, we want to know what's beneath, because we have the imagination that, well, that which is beneath is that which is governing.
And you know what I mean? It makes sense that they could only use the terms they had available to them to convey that experience. And their terms were given to them by the tradition. So why I mention that, it gives us the difference between the surface and the depth of a text. The surface expression, if you didn't entertain the hypothesis that there was a single underlying experience that was being interpreted differently, and all you had were the two different surfaces, you might think you're dealing with two completely different things. Right? So now the way this maps over to Strauss on the history of political philosophy, I have to say briefly, because it's, I don't think I've said this explicitly anywhere else, but it's a nice connection to draw. So Strauss argued similarly that there is a human possibility that is the same at all periods of time. That man is not just a function of his time and place, like the historicists argued, or the cultural relativists argued, but there's some human experience that transcends time and place. Now, he did not say that it was the mystic experience. He said it was the experience of being philosophical. The experience of being philosophical means not a direct encounter with the absolute or something like we talked about on the mystic side of the equation.
Now I found this all very interesting. Part of what's interesting is, again, well, it's so you have the mystical and then you have the expression. But here you have the particular, and underneath it there's the philosophical. It's very interesting.
But it means raising a set of fundamental questions about the nature of the good life, the nature of the good society, what is justice, what is time, is the universe created or eternal? Fundamental questions. So Strauss's view is that if you read the history of political philosophy well, you will see, and I got to make this case, it's so beautiful, I'll try to be quick about it, but you'll see that underlying the apparent surface disagreements, and there are some, there's a fundamental underlying set of shared questions and concerns that transcend time and place.
Right.
Now, Strauss is famous, among other things, for this idea.
Now again, notice, what's our desire? It's to get beyond the particular. It's to get beyond the pervasive pluralism. It's to get beyond all this and get to that which is underneath. Now, this is deeply religious, obviously, because, and this gets into God number one and God number two, because that which is underneath is God. And part of the way God functions in our systems is that which you can't get beyond God. You can't get around God. It is God is that which holds everything together. And if you have God, you have everything, because it is, there's no outside. Well, this gets complicated theologically, of course, but there's no outside of God, speaking as a Calvinist, of God's will, of God's power. God is sovereign.
Of esoteric writing, esoteric reading, the art of writing between the lines. So like a Straussian reading is one that treats an author as having said something other than he apparently said. Okay, Strauss had this view that authors in the history of political philosophy conceal their true teaching between the lines of their text. They have very many ways to do that. So deliberate contradictions, for example, repeating something they said in the text later in the text with a slight modification, all kinds of tricks, basically, that allow them to speak to different audiences at the same time, convey two different teachings in one in the same book or one in the same writing, and that we need to learn that way of reading them. Okay.
So now, in a sense, you have a mystical way of reading political philosophy, which is fascinating. Now, this is not the interest of the video, and so I'm going to get beyond this, but this entire video I found fascinating. So thank you, Nate. Thank you, Sherry, for pointing this out, and very helpful. But I want to get to some other things.
I give all the credit for what I do to my teachers. My two greatest teachers are Leo Strauss and Martin Heidegger, and what I credit them with is to put the deep questions in front of me that I couldn't see without their help. So what I try to share with my students, what I try to share in my work, is giving us more and more of the big picture to think about. What people do after that, where they go, what arguments strike them as reasonable, what questions attract them or repel them, is out of my hands.
Okay, so name the great mystics. Who are the most famous mystics? The ones that you are talking about. Who are we talking about?
Okay, I'll leave that for you to hunt down in the video yourself and give Thaddeus Russell. He's got a commercial. I don't remember what the commercial was for. I got an email from somebody some company who wondered if I would be interested in paid promotion. It was actually sort of a keto breakfast cereal. I told this to my wife, and she said, "You should have Freddie do all the commercials for your channel." I'd obviously have to give Freddie a cut, and that might impact his disability with Social Security. But I thought it would be incredible if we'd have Freddie do all the commercials for the channel. Anyway, okay, I want to get to the transition to Putin.
Practice of mystical prayer, repetition of named, like a mysticism of names. Pseudo-Dionysus the Areopagite, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. That's somebody I was reading back in the day, as well as Hermetic mystics and things. St. John of the Cross. Evelyn Underhill is a good scholar of Christian mysticism. Among Jewish thinkers, there's several mystical tendencies. You could read Gershom Scholem on Kabbalists and things like that. But it's that whole realm taken together. Plotinus was an important, for me personally, probably the most important ones were Neoplatonic mystics, the Eastern Orthodox mystics. It's not that I really studied them. I encountered a few of their phrases. I encountered a few of their texts. I encountered a few of their writings, and it like pierced like an arrow, let's say. And someone I'd been reading recently that I thought was really nice on this is, and there's a Dugin connection, but he's a scholar. His name is Henri Corbin, Corbin. He was the first person to translate fragments of Heidegger into French, but he also worked on Islamic thought and Islamic mysticism. So he's got a book called Creative Imagination in Ibn Arabi. Ibn Arabi's a medieval Islamic thinker.
And correct me if I'm wrong, isn't this the Corbin that Vervaeke deals with towards the end of his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis?
And a Russian guy named Vladimir Solovyov. So I remember like it was yesterday, I was walking through the library of the university I was at the time, and this book jumped off the shelf. It was called Vladimir Solovyov, Russian Mystic.
Now, I skipped the first part of the video. He is the son of emigres from Soviet emigres. His mother was an engineer, and his father, I forget what his father did, but emigrated eventually to Canada, where he was born and raised. And he eventually got into school, decided that he wanted to learn more Russian. He grew up with some of it in his home. And so that's what he started studying in university. And besides the experience in high school of studying the Transcendentalists, he then begins to get into Russian mysticism.
Okay, Vladimir Solovyov, the beautiful thing about this Russian mystic, Vladimir Solovyov, is that he died in 1900, the same year Nietzsche died. And for me, it was always symbolic of the distance or the difference between East and West, because Solovyov and Nietzsche are two very different figures. And yet their lives overlap to the point that they died in the same year. And you could try to triangulate to a certain extent the different meaning of Russia and the West, I think, maybe, by reading Nietzsche on one hand, Solovyov, this Russian mystic on the other hand, and trying to, like I say, triangulate to something beyond East and West, taken individually. But yeah, those are the kinds of, definitely the Russian, by the way, how I got into Dugin in a way, Alexandr Dugin, was as an undergraduate with some Russian language background, because my parents came from the former Soviet Union, as I said, and this interest in mysticism, I began to become aware of the Russian tradition of religious thought, which tends to be more mystical and less rationalistic than the Western tradition. And so like Berdyaev, for example, Berdyaev was somebody that I was looking into at the time, just the school of Russian thinkers, Russian religious thinkers, all of whom have a mystical characteristic or quality to them. Solovyov was one of the main ones. So I thought, I'm going to learn Russian and start translating. The first person I had planned to translate was Vladimir Solovyov. I also planned to translate this guy named Nikolai Fyodorov. He's a futurist. So I wanted to do work on Russian futurists and cosmists. But I ended up reading an article about Dugin called Alexandr Dugin, Prophet of a New Russian Empire, which said, this is where all the threads came together. It said, here's a philosopher who is extremely influential at the Kremlin. He'd recently been kicked, as of the time of this article, he'd recently been kicked out of Ukraine. And as a result, Vladimir Putin expelled the Ukrainian ambassador, meaning that Dugin was so high profile a philosopher that there was they had his back politically, which was just interesting to me. Wow. Because it's like a philosopher king type configuration. Yeah. The political philosopher at the peak of his game. Right. And the article also said that Dugin had this background in occult mysticism. And furthermore, that you couldn't understand Russia without understanding Dugin. So it was like, boom, 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 all the lights went off. Philosopher king, Plato, political philosophy, mysticism, occultism, understanding Russia, Russian language. Bam, that was like the start for me of working on Dugin.
Holy crap. Okay, so we're gonna talk about Dugin. But before we do that, I want to finish on this mysticism thing. And my turn toward God, maybe. That might be happening. So I think the answer to the question you asked me about why I've been moving in that direction toward religion, being at least sympathetic to religion and being very open to the possibility of God. I think I can.
Are we watching the atheism recede? Yes, we are.
Actually, probably answer that question by asking you about your initial experience. You talked about this at the beginning of the interview, about that was the first thing that turned you on intellectually was mysticism. And you said some things when you were describing that that suggest that you and I have something similar in our relationship with mysticism, spirituality, religion, God. Can you talk about your first encounter with it, and what was it personally for you, psychologically for you?
Notice Thaddeus Russell's categories here. It's so Western. That's the West.
That was so appealing. I have some guesses.
It was so appealing. It's almost consumeristic.
Go ahead.
Okay. I'll tell you, I remember the exact moment where I knew that I had been dialed in to this realm or domain.
Whoa.
Okay, I'm going to tell the story really quickly, okay?
Yeah.
My parents divorced and I moved to the States. I was going to school in Michigan. I was like 15, 16 years old, okay? So I moved to the States with my mom and I was going to school there. I wasn't a great...
His mom worked in the automotive industry. Now, he's about to tell the story that I told a little bit of.
Student, okay, I wasn't trying very hard in class. I wasn't, skipping some classes, et cetera, et cetera. We had an English class, and we were reading the Transcendentalists, okay, Emerson and Thoreau. The teacher came to class and he said, class, today's a very special and strange day. I had a student write on this topic pretty much like even better than my answer key. So he's given this talk about anybody who wants to check their understanding of transcendentalism should just come and read this student's paper. So I was sitting there with my head down, not even thinking, because we had a super smart guy in the class who was always like, he's getting the best marks on everything, and he's the go-to guy, and he's the super genius. And then the professor said, Michael Millerman. And I didn't know until that moment that somehow I have a facility in dealing with this world of transcendental mysticism and that kind of thing. And that I found myself later in life. I mean, I don't want to go into too many details because it's obviously not about me in this case. It's about the subject matter, about the authors, and about the experiences. But you could say that I had many cases in my life. In fact, if it wasn't overly presumptuous of me to do, I would continue working on my little mystical memoir. Many experiences in my life where the guiding thread was something having to do with mysticism, transcendence, and that kind of thing, more than just conceptually, let's say. So very much like an orienting theme in a hero's journey type configuration. In other words, a guiding thread of my life. But that was the moment where it was clear to me that, okay, like, I mean, it wasn't, I was just weird. Like, why should it have been the case that this topic that was it wasn't super easy for me because I'm smart or something. Like I said, I wasn't particularly great. I wasn't the best student in class. I was just maybe because of the divorce or whatever, right? Whatever. But understanding and feeling into and living with and being in the realm of the transcendentalists and later of the mystics, and probably this applies to my facility with Heidegger, my interest in Heidegger, my work on Heidegger, just being able to get in there and being able to live as though there's a destiny unfolding. Somehow that was just there for me. But that's when it became clear to me. Yeah, that's a weird way of putting it, but that's like in the background of everything. It's in the background of my life in a big way. But I can't point to I can point to many experience. There are many moments of my life where the presence of the mystical reality was there, let's say. Okay. But the one where the light dawned on me was with the transcendentalists in that English class back in the day.
When you were a teenager in high school.
Yeah, absolutely.
Before you encountered the dry,
very interesting story, well told,
barren halls of academe, where they have where they have excised much of human life. We don't study much of human life.
Now this I found interesting too, thinking back about Dallas Willard and how he begins the Divine Conspiracy.
In universities anymore, right? We don't study. We're not interested in, things like what you're talking about. And that's, I think, where I'm going here. The
reason that we avoid religion is because we want to find a way around pluralism.
First started talking about your attraction to mysticism. You said something that Dugin said to me when I interviewed him, which is that, in so many words, you both said mysticism and that tradition captures, or at least attempts to comprehend, all of human existence.
Oh, yeah.
All of the experiences.
And of course, I, as a Dutch Calvinist, can't hear this and not think, Abram Kuyper, there's not one square inch. And it's like, isn't all of our religion trying to get at a totality of vision that helps the world come into one piece? This is, of course, why we're struggling against pluralism and looking for something that will be pluralism proof.
Seeks to understand, at least, and provide answers to everything we feel, everything we think, everything that happens to us, both intentionally and accidentally. They are curious about that. And of course, they have all sorts of different answers. And I don't care if they're right or wrong about the answers. What's important to me is that they care about these feelings these feelings, which is really, I think, really what it is.
Very American.
That universities trained, university professors trained in the Enlightenment tradition of rationalism and science and logic are not only uninterested in, they're hostile to it.
Very interesting. Why are they hostile to it? Well, because the Enlightenment was supposed to be a universal system that was able to handle pervasive pluralism. But, well, now at the recession of modernity, now, well, obviously hasn't. And in fact, the university, which is captive in many respects, not all universities, of course, but in many respects captive to it, hasn't been able to handle it. Now, this is where a bunch of the different threads of this channel get quite interesting, because part of what we're dealing with is, so, Jordan Peterson, again, is sort of this guy who very much stands in modernism, but wants to keep both feet on modernism and look over at the other shore and think, well, can the storyverse really touch down into the matterverse? Can this divide be bridged? I should get back to the Pilgrim's Regress. I about a month ago I was rereading Pilgrim's Regress, and in Pilgrim's Regress you have this chasm, which Mother Kirk, if you get on, she's an old lady, and if you get on her back, she'll take you down. But people look at Mother Kirk like, I don't know if I want to get on that old lady's back.
Because it challenges at the most fundamental level, which is our fucking feelings, the entire Enlightenment project and all of
what is that most fundamental level?
Modernity. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. The mystic gesture, like in some other cases, is all comprehensive. It aims for, like in Solovyov's turn, all unity and everything taken together. It's tries to put us, yeah, absolutely, into a sort of comprehensive. And one beautiful.
Now there's, when I hear something like this, the Christian posture is one of, I don't need to be master. There is a master. I need to be a faithful servant, but there already is a master. And I think this is why, in many ways, Christianity scales, and a lot of visions, unifying visions, such as, I'm not going to speak about all mysticisms, but any unifying vision that affords or promises me the totalizing universal vision, I'm skeptical of, because I think basically I can't handle it. It's too great for me. And so I defer to one that can, and play my part as a whatever part I am capable of playing. And so I'm always a little skeptical of things that are too wonderful for me, as the psalmist says.
Beautiful thing, again, just to make, I want to make this surprising connection because I'm surprised by it coming up for me as a result of our conversation. Strauss, in political philosophy, says that there's the notion of the regime, of the comprehensive political community. And he recovers that in his study of Plato and Aristotle. And what he says is the regime has fallen out of analysis in political science in the same way that all unity, I add, has fallen out of our study, the mystic comprehensiveness that is ignored at the universities is akin to the comprehensiveness of the political community called the regime that's ignored in departments of political science. And the opposite gesture, the way away from that atomization, or the way away from specialization, from narrowing our horizons, from constraining our vision, from keeping our heads down so we can only look at the dirt and at the dust, and allowing us to see the big picture, Mystics are about the big picture. Strauss and Heidegger, each in their own way, is about the big picture, putting that back. Dugin, as you know, people who watch your interview will know, the breadth and the depth of his interests, of his questions, of the authors that he draws on. So you could say the whole gesture here is reversing narrow specialization atomization, and constraint, and going back to majestic gestures that are comprehensive, all embracing. And crucially, not just horizontally, also vertically. We want the heights and the depth and the breadth of human existence. Yeah.
Okay.
So, well, isn't this, in fact, in some ways, the hope of a religion at the center of a culture? Of course, there's a hole in the center of the culture that we need to be filled by a religion, but, well, obviously a religion would be both horizontal and vertical. It would be shaped like this.
Okay. I'm still a little bit skeptical about this. And I'm going to find out if the mystics are for me. You ready? It's a simple question. Michael, what do they say about sex? Fairly important thing in human experience, right? Fairly important thing. Many of sex.
What is first, so to speak? In order, okay, this is pretty. How could you put it? Imagine that we have some feeling realm, like you put it, feelings, and it's a completely comprehensible sellers of taste and touch, or do they?
This isn't a great part of the video. I'll jump ahead.
We're going to talk about mostly here, which is your relationship with Alexandr Dugin and what that has meant for your career. So you had essentially the same experience that I did. You essentially got fired from academia. You were told that you did not belong here. You should not teach our beautiful young minds, and you are a dangerous person. But let's tell that story. So how did you find out?
Now, here's where we bump into universalism. That, well, we want something universal. We want something comprehensive. We want something that's going to address pervasive interpretive pluralism. We want something that's going to connect the horizontal and the vertical. This is another good story.
Find out about Dugin?
It was that article, Alexandr
right.
Dugin, Prophet of a New Russian Empire, that I was reading. The journal's called Azure. I don't know that they exist anymore. All kinds of nice, interesting connections there, because it was co-founded by a guy named Yoram Hazony, who works on nationalism. He's got a book called Virtue of Nationalism. He hates Dugin, he hates Heidegger, and yet it was in his journal that I found out about Dugin and became like the leading Dugin guy. But that's just a historical accident. So yeah, I read that article. I was very interested in it. And then I started Googling. Like, this was 2011, I think.
And you were were you in graduate school?
No, I was undergraduate. I was doing
Okay.
undergraduate Department of Philosophy at University of British Columbia. And I started just doing a little bit of digging. Great article. So I was like hooked. I wanted to learn more about him. And one of the first things that I found was about a short 5-minute speech of his on this idea called the fourth political theory. It was the first time I'd heard it.
Right.
And he says, in a nutshell, you had liberalism, communism, and fascism fighting in the 20th century. Liberalism was the last ideology standing. What if you want to oppose liberalism and you don't want to do it as a communist or a fascist? You have no place to stand. And yet, if all three of liberalism, communism, and fascism are spent forces, we need to declare the space of a fourth political theory. I thought that was pretty
Now, that's very interesting. If you read Yuval Harari, you get a very similar perspective, although Harari believes that liberalism will sort of continue to morph. One of the articles I mentioned was the, I'll just pull it up, hand-waving freak-outery. BJ Campbell sent me this on Twitter. Very interesting, a long piece, whole lot about game B. Now, in some ways, Jordan Hall, this is his conversation back and forth with Jordan Hall, gets into ants, apes behaving like ants. Interesting article. BJ Campbell gets all the way to the end of it, which is, sort of where he's been trying to think things through. I think you need to consider the idea that religion may well be the scaling system you're looking for if religion itself weren't centralized. Do you understand what I mean by that? That's how he ends it. Now, this is where in some ways all of these pieces come together, of course, in religion. I liked how Millerman looks at Dugin here. Now, Dugin, I've done some listening and some looking around, there's some real issues with that. And let me pull up something else. Now those of you around this channel will recognize James. I don't know how to say your last name, James. I know you comment and you're around here, and of course Nate's been on your channel. And but he reads Special Operation Z by Alexandr Dugin, and I was listening to a bunch of this while I was doing my expense report, and boy, it's interesting stuff.
Turn to a deep Russian values and the Russian mission. Creation of completely autonomous and sovereign statehood without any reference to the norms of the West, capitalism, democracy, parliament, human rights, network technologies, gender politics, etc. Building a new society based on a new political theory, fourth political turn, where the church, the empire, the people and justice are at the center. Having returned to its trajectory, Russia, having emerged from the communist era, was called upon to preserve the continental state, held together by the empire and the Eurasian ideology. There were no republics, including no Russian Federation, in the plans of Providence. We returned to the fulfillment of the mission for which we were created by God. But the devil was vigilant, attentive, and awakened, and led us astray. Having gone through the difficult path of restoration, first of all spiritual, and then material, we would enter a new round of confrontation with the West, with the, quote, civilization of the Antichrist, which during this time would become more and more openly satanic. The destruction of sex and families, preparation for the transfer of power to artificial intelligence, the total degeneration of morals, the dominance of extremely perverted philosophies such as postmodernism or LLC. Our fate was written in golden letters in heaven, and was read by Russian czars, saints, elders, ascetics, warriors, philosophers, poets, and artists from the first century of Holy Russia. We had to do just that, and that would be reality, moving clockwise. But we didn't just turn off this path. We collapsed, breaking through the bottom into a sub-reality. And the movement...
I'll put the link to this. The whole thing is just fascinating. But without some context, which Millerman gives, now Millerman's going to refer to this interview that he did on the agenda with Steve Piken. Piken. Now, those of you who are been around the Jordan Peterson space long enough know that this was the program that Jordan Peterson was a regular on, of course, before he was even more famouser than he is now. But I'm not going to play any of this, because if I play this, well, you know, these legacy media organizations continue to keep their hands on their intellectual property through YouTube. But again, Millerman knows how to tell a good story.
Compelling. It was short. It was sweet. It was just like I presented it to you now, structurally made sense to me. And it also helped me to explain something I had been noticing, which was that whoever was criticizing liberalism, not from the left, was automatically being called a fascist.
Yep.
Even if it's obvious that they're not fascists.
Right.
So Dugin's model explained that. If you only think in terms of liberalism, communism, and fascism, and you're criticizing liberalism not from the left, ipso facto, you're a fascist.
Right.
So I thought, okay, well, since the people I'm interested in are obviously not fascists, but they're criticizing liberalism not from the left, this idea of a fourth political theory is intriguing to me. So next thing I did is I went on the Wikipedia page that he had at the time. And
now, of course, that modernity is receding. The questions are, well, what comes next? And of course, because the liberal Western democracies are deeply modernistic in their entire framing, the question is, well, if modernity continues to recede, what will become of these? Now, establishment Protestantism has receded. And the question is, well, if that, in fact, was the religious impulse that created the United States and the copying of the United States that the rest of Western democracies have done, what comes next? Now, I for reasons that I'll get into a little bit later in this video, don't think Russia's the future.
I went to the Russian version of it, and I noticed he had a book in Russian called The Fourth Political Theory. So I just heard him give a 5-minute talk on it. Then I saw he had a book on it. And I proposed to my Russian language supervisor, let me translate this book. Because I mentioned I wanted to start translating Russian philosophy. And
Now remember, this is an undergrad. So let me translate this book. Sure, no problem.
in order to learn technical Russian terminology, technical Russian philosophical terminology. So he said, my supervisor said, pick an old philosopher and a living philosopher. For the old one, I picked this futurist. And for the new one, I picked Dugin on the basis of what I just told you. His 5-minute talk and the fact that he was alive and had a book called The Fourth Political Theory. As it happens, I never got to the futurist because I just continued working on Dugin over the pretty much decade now. So I started translating his book, The Fourth Political Theory, and my supervisor was like, this is 2011. So Putin had just he just announced the creation of a Eurasian Economic Union. And here I was translating the ideologist of Eurasianism, neo-Eurasianism. Wow. So my supervisor's like, every time I brought a translation to him, he was like, this is amazing. This is literally like, you're doing something extremely valuable here, he said to me. And he said, have you considered reaching out to Dugin about getting this published? I hadn't, but since he suggested it, I did. And Dugin said that he already has a publisher in the US getting ready to publish The Fourth Political Theory. Someone else had been translating it in parallel. So the press, Arctos, said, why don't we put together what we have already completed with what you've completed and push it out for this July 2012 conference that had been around the corner. So that is how my translation of The Fourth Political Theory was combined with someone else's. I became the co-translator of the first Dugin book to be released in English. And that has, I think, opened up some doors for the study of Dugin in English. And
now, of course, this is 2011. Other things are coming down the road.
Then I just kept translating his books after that, one after another, because they were interesting to me. And yeah, my university didn't take too kindly to this association with Putin's brain and the most dangerous philosopher in the world. I'll just add one piece of the puzzle here. In 2014, I was invited onto Canadian TV to give an interview on Putin's brain. So 2014.
That, of course, is this interview.
Is when Russia-Ukraine was last a hotspot. Okay, that's when you had the war in Eastern Ukraine and Donbass and all of that. And I was working on Dugin. And I was invited to give an interview on Ontario TV in Canada, okay? But it was the only time that anybody had in a televised forum explained the Russian perspective without all kinds of liberal distortions. And so the clip went viral, you know? But I think for this kind of topic.
It's a great interview. And what's really good is that Piken, I'm sure you'll correct my pronunciation of his name if I don't have it right. He really goes after him. I think in a really competent way. He basically says, "Hey, isn't everybody leaving to come to America? Why does this guy think he's the future?" And so Millerman at this point, of course, this is 2014. He's obviously 8 years younger than he is now. He's just a grad student, and he's having this interview, and he stands up pretty well. But
it was viral. Like over 100,000 people have watched it by now. And after that interview, I got called into many offices, and I got many a finger wagging, and I had 4 professors resign from my dissertation committee, and I was accused of being a Russian agent, and I was told, I'd never work in this town again, that kind of thing. And people tried to sabotage my funding. And basically there was a big blowback. And that blowback lasted for several years as I barely managed to finish my PhD because there was a war against me. And you know how these things go.
I do.
But people were not keen on having, the amazing thing.
Liberalism when it isn't liberal.
Is that professors, and you know such professors, and your listeners know such professors and such people who pride themselves on diversity, on otherness, on studying the other, as long as it's the right kind of other. As soon as you study the wrong kind of other, namely a Russian conservative, who, as you spoke to him, he's other,
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Oh yeah,
he's very other, but he's the wrong kind of other. So if you go there, right-wing anti-liberalism, Russian conservatism, German conservative revolution, that is the wrong kind of other. All the tolerance for diversity goes out the window, and all the apparatus of repression and reputation destruction and everything else you can think of goes into high gear.
Alexandr Dugin is the philosopher of diversity. That's what he stands for. That's what his work is. He is for diversity. And to me, he's an anti-imperialist. To me, that's what sort of unites all of his ideas. It's a remarkable what they did to you. Yeah, you had a much bloodier, nastier exit from the academy than I did. Mine was pretty bad, but yours was much worse. I mean, they went while you were writing the dissertation, they were fully at war with you. 4 of your professors on your committee resigned from your dissertation committee.
Yeah, that's right. So over the years, I had 4 dissertation committee members resign. But the most despicable act, in my view, was that several years after one of them had resigned, so they resigned. They all signed off on my dissertation project, which included my work on Dugin. They all knew about my work on Dugin going in, and then they panicked or freaked out and reacted in the way that they did. But several years after that, when I was still in the course of my PhD, one of the people who resigned was making phone calls behind my back to the new members on my committee, telling them not to work with me and trying to sabotage the committee. So in some cases successfully, and in other cases he was told to go to hell by people with the spine. But the idea that they could be so invested in sabotaging my work, and I should add, just so that there's no confusion about this, I graduated top of my class. My student reviews were over 90% for all of the 5 years that I was there. Yeah. And eventually I did win a major national scholarship for my research. So that's not like I was a shitty teacher and a bad scholar.
Of course.
Well, the attacks were completely...
Excuse me, sir. You currently are charging a lot of money for people to take your courses online on philosophy. Okay. Guess what those motherfuckers can't do? They can't charge a dime, because no one wants to take their courses. So you've demonstrated already as an entrepreneur that you are superior as a teacher and a thinker and a scholar to them. You've proven it, because people spend their money on you.
Right. There's directly. No degree at the end of the tunnel at the Millerman School, and people go because they want to learn. They want the questions without the ideological baggage that they're getting at the universities, just as you know, hence the success of Renegade University. Yeah. So it was a blessing in disguise. I consider it probably the same for you, because getting blacklisted from academia meant getting green-lighted for this independent alternative, which I...
Now, this sent me down a Dugin rabbit trail, and he's a very interesting thinker, more from the Special Operations Z.
Movement began in the opposite direction, in the imaginary world, in the silt of being located under matter. Further, everything is known. Instead of a break with the West, its blind and crooked copying and obsequious worship, liberals, reformers, Yeltsin's 90s. Instead of turning to Russian roots, cosmopolitanism, and open Russophobia, when everything Russian was equated with, quote, red-brown, a coven of liberalism, postmodernism, and, quote, modernization, where the same West acted as the standard of modernity. Instead of sovereign statehood, an attempt to integrate on miserable grounds into the global West, loss of independence, external control, destruction of the best in Soviet society, plunders of resources, imitation of the Western political, social, economic, and cultural system. Instead of the revived Russia-Eurasia as a single state of the great empire, the pole of the multipolar world, there was a collapse of the USSR and the construction of ugly, imitative structures at the behest of the West. At the same time, the West supported nationalism and even Nazism everywhere except Russia, since Russian identity is not national, but imperial. Those imitative...
And that's interesting, because, of course, Thaddeus Russell says it's anti-imperial, but I think it's imperial in the way that the Russian Empire before the USSR was imperial. It's an empire, again, if you read Hirari, an empire is sort of something made up of kingdoms. And so, but this is very much a vision of the flourishing of civilization, and they very much see themselves in an existential battle with liberalism in the West.
Nationalists who were in small numbers in Russia were carefully supported by the West in order to destroy the Eurasian imperial unity from within. That is, we began to do the exact opposite of what we were supposed to do. We forgot about the side of the spirit in general. Everything came down to material indicators, and even then forged in the interests of the corrupt elite and the Western masters. In the 1990s, Russia was ruled by the devil. It was anti-Russia. That is, the exact opposite of what it was supposed to become. Everything in the post-Soviet space was anti-Russia in the 90s. Not only Ukraine, but also the Russian Federation. Therefore, Putin emerged from the depths of his own anti-Russia. It was necessary from the point of view of the logic of the spiritual side of Russian history. Go-Katikon, restraining, man of destiny, but impossible from the point of view of material causal processes.
Now, it's interesting because I don't know a ton about Putin by any means. I listened to the rest of his history, listened to a bunch of other things. You know, Putin in some ways reigned in the oligarchs. And again, the rest of his history had a wonderful 4-part series on the rise of Putin and their podcast. And so Putin sort of reigns in the oligarchs, but corruption continues to be endemic in Russia. It was in Ukraine. Part of the reason Ukraine didn't get into the European Union was they had to curtail corruption, and now, of course, they're everyone's cause now. And Zelensky loves beating it on them. You know, just one interesting tidbit. I really love T.H. Lerman's book, When God Talks Back. I read it when it came out, and I hadn't yet picked up How God Becomes Real, and so I started that this morning actually, and was really enjoying it. And she's a good observer. She really is. She's a good, honest scholar. I loved how she begins this chapter 1 with the faith frame. Devout modern Christians talk constantly about not being faithful enough. They bemoan how hard it is to keep God's love at the front of their minds. They complain about forgetting about God between Sunday services. They apologize for not being able to trust God to solve problems. I remember a man weeping in front of a church over not having sufficient faith that God would replace the job that he had lost. When you pay attention, you can see church services are about reminding people to take God seriously and behave in ways that will enable God to have an impact on their lives, to pray, to read the Bible, to be Christ-like. And then people say that they go back and yell at their kids and feel foolish because they have forgotten that they meant to be like Jesus. They report that they run out of time to pray, and they confess that they do not behave as if God can help them. They worry that they do not really understand or commit as they should. In fact, when you look carefully, you can see church is about changing people's mental habits Sunday after Sunday so that they feel that God is more real, more relevant, more present to them, so that they behave more than they did when they walked in. They believe more than they did when they walked in, and hold on to those beliefs a little longer after they walk out. And one of the clearest messages in Christianity, you may think you believe in God, but you really don't. You don't take God seriously enough. You don't act as if he's there. Mark 9:24, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. The apparent paradox believers as the unbelieving stood out to me when I was doing ethnographic fieldwork with charismatic evangelical Protestants in Chicago and in the San Francisco South Bay. Lerman, When God Talks Back. Now, this is not just in the church. The West loves a beating by Zelensky. You're not helping enough. We're not helping enough. No fly zone. No fly zone. I mean, this is deep in the culture of the West. They're not in church, and many who have looked at Ukraine have noted that they're not going to church either. But this stuff is in them. So here we have this vision of this alternate society, and Dugin has this vision about how now, with religion again at the center, the civilization will rise and hold back the corruption of the West. And if you listen to this and, let's say, the Islamists like bin Laden, how much similarity is there? It's resisting the West. I put up this meme yesterday, and again, it's not NATO. It's Western democracy's religiosity that is right there by Russia, and I'm not touching you. Oh, you're invading me. You're invading me, and I have this vision of an alternative universe, and it's not coming about. But again, in my opinion, back to the slide, modernity is receding. The West may have we may be at our peak, and we may be at our peak of power. And I loved how Pagan pushed back. Hey, let's pay attention. People vote with their feet. And Dugin has all these visions of how this is going to go forward. And, well, found this guy. This was another fascinating video. Now, it's not just this video. I've, in fact, watched a fair amount of videos, even before the Ukrainian hostilities began, talking about the situation in Russia.
Peter Zion here, coming to you from Colorado. We are now in the third week of the Ukraine war, and I wanted to discuss a little bit about the limitations that the Russians are facing back at home, economically, and on the battlefield, and it all really comes back to the Russian demographic. The Russians...
And this is fascinating because it loops back into the Ross Douthat Decadence book, which I thought was a tremendous book. It doesn't get anywhere near enough attention. I start reading many more books than I finish, but I finished that one.
The system has faced a number of serious trials and tribulations over the course of the last century. The defeat in World War I gutted a whole generation of young men, which then was insufficient to repopulate, and that generation, the following generation, was gutted in World War II. Khrushchev forced everybody in.
Now remember, Russia lost huge numbers in World War II. I mean, that war was absolutely devastating, and so often with Putin, you can hear the echoes of it. I mean, they're still living with the multi-generational post-traumatic stress from what Germany did to Russia.
Into condos, which reduced the birth rate. Brezhnev presided over a decade of stagnation, which reduced the birth rate. And then ultimately, with the Soviet collapse in 1989, we entered a decade period where the birth rate halved and the death rate doubled. That has generated a massive demographic bomb within the Russian system, and there simply are no longer enough Russians remaining to repopulate the country over the course of the next 30 years. So one way or another, Russia is going to vanish as an ethnicity this century, and one of the major reasons why the Putin government decided that now was the time to launch the invasion of Ukraine is if they didn't do it now, they were going to lose the capacity to do it at all.
This hardly sounds like a civilization that is on the verge of flourishing and taking over the world. And again, there's sort of a similarity, although of course the demographics in the Islamic world are at their back because they're the ones who are reproducing, but not Russia, and they're not going to church. And at least the idea of this guy is that this is sort of their last chance.
It's not as big as you think.
Now he's showing here all of Russia has this huge land mass, which still has enormous capacity in terms of its breadbasket, but there's also huge amounts of desert and wilderness that aren't going to be put to productive ends, and it's just very, very difficult for Russia to be able to protect all this. But then again, he goes back to the demographics.
The numbers, and they lie about all their numbers. So, this bulge down here probably is not as big as it looks, because back in 2014, they just found 8 million children that they didn't have in the previous year's census. So, but here's the part that really matters. This is the generation that was born in the 1990s and early 2000s. The Cold War collapse. That's draftable age. Yes, the Russians can probably take the country with 130,000 troops, take Ukraine, but they can't hold it. You guys know that from the experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. Occupying's not easy when the population doesn't want you there. It's a country of 45 million people. That's Iraq plus Afghanistan. And unlike Iraq and Afghanistan, where the population concentrations were pretty tight, Ukraine is farmland. Not
so in other words, not a lot to look forward to. He has a very interesting video in China as well, where he looks at population collapse and that the population collapse is happening earlier. So where are we? Well, we're looking around for sort of a anti-Western something to address pervasive pluralism, something to unite. The West has its problems, but it still has a cultural power that threatens and intimidates Russia and China. And in some ways, it looks like Russia and China are going to cozy up to each other. Rebel Wisdom, the guy in Rebel Wisdom that talked about this, talked about that, because China feels like, well, even in this piece, the hand waving freakoutery. I mean, there's a fair amount of China fear in there, but whether that's founded, we'll see. But basically, the question is, where do we go in the future? And the Russian way of, it seems you can build church buildings, but if the religion isn't working for your population, we're going to have to get into at some point what we mean by working, it's not going to do you much good. And you're not reproducing as a culture. You're not sustaining your population. You're not a vibrant, flourishing culture. And you look around the world and you're looking for a vibrant, flourishing culture. And the Islamic world, deeply struggling and divided and violent. The Russian world collapsing. The Chinese world seems to be going strong, but look at how they're dealing with zero COVID. And if this guy is right about what's happening demographically to China, they also might be, the world might be a very dangerous place now that some of these collapsing cultures and empires get existential. But here in the West, we have our own crises. We have a meaning crisis. What do we fill the hole in the center of the culture with? And in many ways, that's the heart of the conversations we're having. Peugeot, can orthodoxy in the West flourish to replace establishment Protestantism? Establishment Protestantism has collapsed. Evangelicalism, will it sort its act out? Catholicism, can Catholicism figure out how it can step into where Protestantism has collapsed? Will Christianity evolve again to refresh and replenish and reflourish the culture, being able to appropriate the goods of modernity while cutting off its dead ends? Seems to me this is exactly where we're at. So, fascinating. So let me know what you think. Well, I don't know if anybody's going to watch this video, but I found it all quite interesting.